Welcome to TeleGeography Explains the Internet, the show that explores the business behind all of the ways humans stay connected around the world. I'm your host, Greg Bryan, right now, the Telecom Santa. Around this time of year, in addition to dyeing my beard white to play Santa at various events around the world, I enjoy doing our Year in Review series at TeleGeography. This is the second episode in our three-part series, catching up with my colleagues at TeleGeography and what they thought was most interesting in telecoms in the past year and what they're going to be watching for in the coming one. If you're just joining, you can go back and check out our first episode on transport networks, submarine, and terrestrial developments in the infrastructure business. This episode focuses on all things pricing and enterprise networks. Finally, in our forthcoming episode, we'll talk about data center and cloud trends. But today, joining me are my colleagues Rob Schult, who leads our pricing practice, and Brianna Boudreau, who manages our SD-WAN and NaaS research. Today, we're answering questions like, are we really seeing the most rare of phenomenon in telecom, pricing stability, and what role is the AI boom maybe playing in this? Just how big are some backbone connections and how do those prices relate to lower sized circuits? Has SD-WAN become the norm in the enterprise networks world? And which SD-WAN players are even left in the market? Is SD-WAN really mostly about security now? Finally, for NaaS, we'll dig into whether bandwidth on demand network as a service has gained any traction in the market and how are providers in this space actually priced out the service. Then we'll look finally at what else has NaaS become and where is it going. Now, before we dive into the interviews, if you enjoy the show, please take a moment to rate us on your preferred podcast platform. Subscribe so that you never miss an update and tell a friend to listen. As always, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'd love to hear your suggestions and feedback for future episodes. Okay, on to the show. Thanks for coming back on the show, Rob.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so Rob, you are the leader of our pricing practice, and I've talked with some of our colleagues all about all these developments, mostly in the kind of infrastructure world. So I wanted to drill down with you on what impact that has on where the rubber meets the road, right? Everyone's always talking about monetization and revenue and all of that's what we do all of this for, right? So obviously, Rob, it's 2025. Literally all I ever talk about these days is AI. And so, in many respects, I see it from the telecom perspective as being like fairly simple. It's bandwidth demand and latency, right? So where you come in and what I want to get from you in terms of looking back at 2025 is how are we seeing all of this potential sort of demand increase develop around the world? I know because it's not, I'm going to be asking you a lot of questions that I also think about or whatever, but you are where the buck stops for these kinds of things, right? So I know that this is going to vary geographically, different, routes, different regions, but take us through what you think were some of the real key places where we saw some maybe differences in price erosion and supply and demand than the trends you and I have been seeing over the past 20 years tend to be pretty stable. And I feel like 2025 was maybe an inflection point, if you would agree with that.
Yes, sure, to a degree. And I think your point about AI, the relevant points are bandwidth demand and latency. Bandwidth demand in particular, just because I think what we're seeing now is sort of the unprecedented scale of requirements. We're not talking 100 gig single sales anymore. You talk about multiple 100 gig, or in many cases, multiple terabits of a requirement. So the shift to really high bandwidth, 400 gig waves in particular is a current trend. In terms of trends, price trends, if we're going to that specifically, I think the thing that's been interesting is overall globally, price erosion has probably slowed in over the last year. There are definitely some pockets, whether it be Africa or Latin America, where we've seen some pretty significant price erosion. But when you're talking about transatlantic, Europe to Asia, intra-Asia, even trans-Pacific, the price trends have geared towards being more stable. But I think for very different reasons, and so we can pick those apart if you like.
Yeah, well, let me first put a pin in that because I know you and I have said for forever, right? Like, oh, you should generally expect transport prices to fall. Depends on the route and depends on the situation of builds or whatever, between what, like 10 and 20% a year. And so, and we saw a little bit of a slowdown with that during the hyperinflationary times just post COVID. But otherwise, that's a new thing for me to hear from you, that prices on some very key routes, Trans-Pacific, Transatlantic, are stable. So I think everybody should take careful note of that. So,
Sure, sure.
yeah.
No, and I think again the reasons differ by region. So
Hmm.
transatlantic, the huge hyperscaler demand. I mean, I think if you look at some of the presentations we've done, we're talking 80% plus of all bandwidth allocated across the transatlantic is relevant or related to hyperscaler requirements, right? So that leaves 20% for the rest of us, and the number of carriers participating in that space is relatively modest. Like it's not multiple dozens.
Right.
It's maybe a dozen, and then probably half of that have a huge concentration of the supply. But the issue, right, is that demand continues to grow and fill the existing capacities that they've activated. So they have a steady stream for demand. There's no real incentive to try to lower prices necessarily. So I think transatlantic, that's kind of where the stability comes from. Europe to Asia is a totally different story. And I think you've probably talked to Paul and some of the other colleagues about that.
Yeah. So I talked to Paul about, in particular, the geographic and political bottleneck that is the Red Sea, and how that, for various complications, has delayed some projects and things like that. And so I definitely want to get from you on what the impact on pricing of that has been. Whereas with Paul, we were talking about driving terrestrial development and things like that.
Sure. Well, I mean, just on the straight subsea part, right? You have fewer options to route your traffic. So that's one consideration. Just because there have been some outages around Yemen in making repairs on like EIG and IMEWE, that those have been delayed. New systems that have been planned for a number of years now, whether it be Blue Ramen, SeaMeWe 6, IEX, which is the India to Europe cable, those have been delayed. So those were meant to bring a huge amount of capacity to fulfill requirements, Europe to Asia, as well as like to India, right? But those have been put on standby. So what you have again is fewer cable systems than you had before because of outages. You have existing cables trying to meet new demand, but can only be upgraded so quickly, right? It takes time to plan, get the engineering piece into place, and then actually deploy it. And then you have these other cables that are meant to fulfill demand but can't be put into service. So what we've seen really on the SeaMeWe 5s and the AE 1s is that companies that have capacity are rolling over leases at existing prices. There's no incentive for them to reduce price. In some cases, they've actually increased price opportunistically, right? Yeah. Which we've hardly ever said on this in our discussions, right? So I think that is a piece of it. I mean, there is some distinction between cables when you're looking at Europe to Asia, right? They're the traditional consortium systems, which are well known. There's also the Peace cable, which is oriented towards Huawei or some of the Chinese operators. Not everybody will buy on that network, so prices tend to be a little bit lower. So there's a bit of bifurcation, but in general, overall, the price Europe to Asia has been pretty stable, and I think we anticipate sort of single-digit price erosion going forward until some of this gets resolved. Now,
Right.
there's a lot of capacity coming online, right? When you talk about CMUI 6 and IAX, those are big projects that will bring a huge amount of capacity and opportunity. To the point about rerouting and diversity through the Arabian Peninsula, pricing wise, that's never going to be competitive, right? So right now, with Falcon being out, which is the flag cable, right, they can take capacity from Jeddah to Al Khobar and then out and onwards, right? But the price across the Arabian Peninsula, if you're comparing that to Europe to Asia, is about 2 times, right? So you're adding a segment that's twice as much just across the Arabian Peninsula,
Let alone the end-to-end journey. Yeah,
exactly. So to try to integrate that into an IP backbone or to a low-cost packet network, that's never really going to work out. So something's going to have to change, whether it be pricing across the Arabian Peninsula or through Iraq and Turkey or however, or the Yemen needs to get resolved and these new systems need to come online.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I touched on this with Paul a little bit, but just there's some structural things about building terrestrial capacity that they cut in both ways. So on the one hand, building terrestrial capacity is way more expensive because you have to cross a bunch of borders. You need rights of way. You know what I mean? You can't just drop a cable on the seafloor. Digging trenches is expensive, but especially across huge expanses of thousands of kilometers, right? On the other hand, right, where those things aren't as much of an impediment, the big difference is that you're talking about dozens of fiber pairs in a submarine cable, whereas you're talking hundreds, thousands of fiber pairs in a terrestrial build.
Sure.
So one thing I wanted to ask you about was like what we see in terms of like terrestrial pricing, where you have this like potential when I do have an existing right of way, and especially in places like terrestrial Europe where there's a lot of population density and industrial development, and you can just throw fiber at the problem, right? What do we see for pricing, for example, in terrestrial Europe where they have all this fiber and they have lit services at much higher capacities?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've kind of hit, I don't want to say the race to the bottom. We've hit the finish line. But prices certainly in the flap are as low probably as they're going to be, I would say.
And the lowest, dare to say, lowest in the world for that level
for
of
100
service,
gig
right?
waves, for 400 gig waves, for sure. And part of that is competition, right? You have more people with fiber that can activate it, and I think that there's certainly a concentration of demand. So certainly in the flap, their capacity requirements. There's AI, their development. There's a lot of cloud development. Name it, it's there. But the thing I think that we've also seen in Europe is just sort of that creep of low prices across the continent. There used to be a really big premium, like Frankfurt to Turkey. There still is, but it's less than it was, right? So you sort of see this unification of price tiers, where before we saw sort of like the Iberian Peninsula was one price, the Baltics was another price, Eastern Europe was a totally another price. Those prices certainly have come closer together.
That's flattening out. Interesting.
Yeah. So that's in Europe. I think terrestrially, that's where we've seen some of the changes, and it comes from carriers that have sort of pan-European networks that are trying to simplify their pricing approach for their customers. And no longer necessarily needs demand sort of a big premium to go to some of these other markets. Sofia is a big place that's grown a lot that we hear about, and that sort of, it hasn't supplanted Frankfurt as a gateway east, but it's where a lot of the requirements from the Caucasus come to. It comes either through Turkey or it comes through the Caspian Sea. Or the Black Sea rather, and then goes onwards to Sofia for interconnection and IP transit stuff.
And then from there, you're easily onto that sort of low cost European terrestrial mesh, right? So
exactly.
I always like to contrast that in some respects with North America. where there's something about just the political geography of Europe being so fractured, right? You have by nature just the PTTs continue to exist, right? Whereas in North America, there's been a lot more consolidation over the years of providers. So do we see a little bit of a premium for terrestrials? There's also an issue in North America of lower population density and larger rural spans to get across and whatnot. But do we see that in the pricing?
Yeah, and honestly, if you look at similar distances, pricing in the US can be almost twice as much as what you see in Europe. So
Really?
it's not
Wow.
distance
Yeah.
based at all.
Yeah. Yeah. You and I remember when we were talking about, DS0 miles and OC3s and yeah.
Exactly. We had the
Yeah.
whole calculator, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think currently it's different carriers have made different approaches. There have been
Mm-hmm.
some that have tried to simplify their pricing. Like you can have continental, like East Coast, West Coast pricing. You can have Northeast pricing. You can have,
Mm-hmm.
North to South, like New York, Miami pricing. But they're relatively few tiers, and that's pretty accurate, I think, for all the different
Mm-hmm.
carriers that we see. And it's in their interest, certainly for their sales team, that's just to have a pretty simplified, predictable plan.
Right.
The thing that we have seen, I think, and what people would say is the scale, again, on the terrestrial side has really taken off. So we're seeing a lot of demand terrestrially in the US for 400 gig. And what you see is that demand grows, then the economics behind it, the number of 400 gig cards that get shipped, all of the costs there improve, which can be translated into lower prices in the future. In Europe, the 400, 100 gig multiple, it's 2.5. Like it's really pretty aggressive.
Yeah.
In US, it's a bit higher, I would say still, sort of in the 3-ish, 3 plus. But if you don't have to look far to see where the canary is,
headed.
right? Yeah, and where it's probably going to go. Yeah, but I think most of the operators are happy with the demand that they're seeing from whether it be from the, what do they call it, the neo clouds, and all these different new markets or new market opportunities. Just not starting at 10 gig, but jumping right to 100 gig, if not right at 400 gig, right? And I think the verdict's still out on how they're using all this capacity.
Yeah. Well, I won't ask you to speculate on that because no one can really speculate on that, how it's all going to work out, but it's there. Yeah. What about other regions like Latin America, for example? Anything notable? Other places around the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think Latin America and Africa, for instance, there's still a bit of a mismatch between supply and demand. I think there in both of those markets, people gained access to infrastructure, put money into those systems. And then in order to get an ROI, they needed to make sales. And that's true in every case. But the issue is if there's not the demand like that we're seeing in Europe or North America, it's harder to stimulate that. And a lot of people have taken to reducing prices to get opportunities. So those are the markets, I think, that we've seen the biggest price erosion. The one I think which is quite interesting, I was just in Singapore last week looking at intra-Asia. And again, one of the things that we try to anticipate when we build our models is how do new systems affect price, right? New capacity entering the market, new availability of supply to sell. How does that interact with the price curve? And the big thing there, and this is true if you listen to all the stuff we talk about, the delays in delivering new subcable systems and like the backlog of production and manufacturing of these subsea systems, it's pretty significant. So 2 cables in Asia, one SJC2 and one ADC, they had been delayed for a significant amount of time. And a lot of carriers were counting on those, for their own internal demand, but also, for sales. So what happened was a lot of their capacity on initial activation was already accounted for. And
Mm-hmm.
really what they needed to do was, as soon as it was activated, go through the exercise of another upgrade. Like the initial lit capacity was not sufficient to meet the initial demand. So what you saw was like there was a price set in pre-sales based on that first period, and then the prices did not go down, and in some cases maybe even went up a little bit
No.
for that next level. So
Right.
that's kind of, certainly in Asia, one of the first times that we've seen direct translation or limitations in supply translating into
Mm-hmm.
flat prices, if not a little bit more. So that's pretty interesting. Trans-Pacific is again, I think, holding pretty well. Like I think it's just the sheer amount of demand. Some of this is it's interesting to see that capacity demand, and you probably talked about this with other people, but like from India can no longer go west. So now some of it's coming east to go to US or Europe,
Because of
right?
that bottleneck in the Red Sea, just to be
Exactly,
clear. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
exactly. So
Mm-hmm.
they're buying, half a terabit at a time on some of the new systems, like Echo. When that comes into service, right? They've got it already pre-positioned to have that onward connectivity. But because they need it desperately, they're not in a place where price is the only thing they're buying at. So
Right. Right.
yeah, yeah,
All right, Rob. One more thing I want to ask you about before we have to wrap up is to go back to the start. That sort of AI. The one thing we know for sure about AI, right? Whatever else might be up in the air, is that it's spurred a massive amount of data center development. So I'm going to talk to our colleague John Yembo about all the things that go into that. But as I've long made the argument that in terms of data center development, it's often network is the last thing on the checklist, right? So they're looking for
absolutely.
power, they're looking for real estate, they're looking for favorable tax situations.
Right.
Then way down that list is network development. So a couple of questions embedded in that are like, first, are we seeing a lot of terrestrial fiber builds out to these new data centers? We have to be, right. And secondly, do you foresee that having an impact on this price stability you're talking about? We're putting all this new fiber in potentially. How do you think that's going to shake out?
Yeah, I mean, I think just in general, it means more demand to fill the networks, right? Like
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
a lot of these remote data centers are built out with laterals, from the core network. So, say in the US, companies like Lumen or Zayo or
Mm-hmm.
Verizon or Cogent, in order to connect them to their network, they have to build out. So it becomes a
Right.
bit of a construction play.
And
So
that's a costly endeavor. Just I've done several episodes on this, and I'm sure most people listening are somewhat familiar. But just in case, that's it's just really expensive to go have truck rolls and backhoes and and getting the rights way and paying all of the different layers, municipal, state, federal, or crossing borders. That's a big undertaking.
yeah, no. So I think in general, those are required to reach these physical locations.
Mm-hmm.
But then what you'll see is that it'll be consumed in the aggregate core network, right? So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the real opportunity is to build out that mesh, expand the total supply, etc. And that's it's yet to be determined. I think, as you noted, that
Sure.
how much will that contribute to the long haul network or the subsea
Mm-hmm.
network requirements, but certainly in segments like between big LLMs and whatnot, it'll consume a huge amount of bandwidth.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that has to be the case when you hear about the amount of computing capacity that they have at these gigawatt data centers and the water cooled GPUs and things like that. Obviously, the part that we can't answer and probably no one can is exactly how and when all of this becomes consumable by the enterprise and all of that. But suffice to say, it strikes me anyway that a key sort of difference between now and if we compare this to the big fiber boom that happened 25 years ago ish, right? That they're under no obligation in a lot of these cases to light all of these, and a lot of the people who are building are building for their own consumption or for a dedicated sort of anchored client already. So suffice to say, it's real hard to speculate exactly what's going to happen, but it doesn't look to us like we're necessarily headed towards like some kind of big oversupply, right?
No, but I think the other side, and we've talked to some of the different fiber providers, is that they're being smarter about their builds so they
Right.
don't hit limits in the future, right?
Right.
So when they put in one duct, they put in two, right? So one is completely empty for the future, and the other one has, could have 1,700 plus fiber pairs, right?
Yeah, economies of scale. If you're
Yeah,
digging the hole and running the trucks, you really ought to stack it up, right? So yeah,
exactly. So,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think that networks at some point, will become oriented around fiber. Like, I mean,
Hmm.
people talk about physical security. Well, if all your traffic's on your own physical um, medium, then you own everything, right? So,
Right.
who knows who knows if that'll translate into corporate network fiber demand? But yeah, no, I mean the level of build has really grown. The number of fibers deployed, and certainly in the metro too, right? Fiber
Hmm.
demand in the
Hmm.
metro
Yeah.
has grown really significantly, between data centers in particular.
Absolutely. And I won't even get into this topic because it's for another time, especially because it's more of a 2026 thing than the 25. But dark fiber kind of making this big resurgence too, in terms of not just the market being about lit service, but there's so many people who have such large capacity needs that they rather go for a dark fiber. We'll table that and maybe like do a follow up on that later.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that the other bit, which is more enterprise oriented, but is
Hmm.
some of this like on demand pricing and new
Hmm.
entry of pricing models into the marketplace for shorter durations.
Right.
I think that's something our team is looking at pretty closely.
And that AI really could impact that a lot. From my perspective, I haven't seen a lot of uptake of that kind of thing. Sort of like uh, cloud-like consumption of network just isn't where most enterprises are. But it's conceivable that AI really upends the way that we consume network, and so I think staying on top of that is going to be really interesting.
Absolutely.
All right, so Rob, looking forward 2026, what do you think all of this leads to? A lot of it's going to be extrapolation of the things you've already been talking about, but what do you think is going to be particularly interesting to follow up on, say when we're talking next year?
Yeah, I mean, do the issues in Yemen get resolved?
Hmm.
Do projects going through the Middle East get completed? That will have a big impact on a lot of different markets. Um, I think the other bit is just the sheer pipeline of new projects. How many of them will get completed? What
Hmm.
opportunity will non-hyperscalers have? Right, because
Hmm.
that's a real question. I think right now, hyperscalers are realizing their own internal demand is significantly higher than maybe what they forecasted. So when they build a 24 fiber pair system, they had an expectation that they could, I don't know, sell off some of those
Yeah, have
fiber
some of it
pairs.
in reserve or even
Yeah,
sell it. Yeah,
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 to to
and that's
to
not going to
to
be the
help
case.
cover the costs. Well, now
Hmm.
they're realizing that maybe they're not going to sell off as many as they thought. So
Right.
that's leaving the non builders, right,
Hmm.
in a quandary in terms of where they're going to get inventory to sell, right? So
Yeah.
accessing fiber pairs at a cost where they can make money given the current market prices, that's a real challenge in
Yeah.
some places. So yeah, there'll be a lot of interest in following who owns fiber pairs and how those things will translate.
And then how about step changes in the capacity? So you've been sort of indicated that we've already seen multiples for 400G go down in Europe to 2-ish, and that's probably as low as they can probably go, right? But I've heard talk, certainly in the metro, connecting data centers, of 800 gig transmission speeds, even 1.6 terabyte. It's still too early to see if any of that will really be deployed, or.
Yeah, my impression, and when we ask people about this, is that we're probably still a couple years away. Like
Mhm.
you can do it
Okay.
in the lab, but
Right.
in terms of like customer requirements,
Just not there
I
yet.
don't see
Yeah.
that yet. Yeah.
Mhm.
maybe very limited cases between data centers or in
Right.
metros.
Right.
Yeah, there was one. I spoke to a guy in India, or based in India yesterday at one of the big new data center providers, saying that he could do terabits on fiber between all their data centers,
Mm-hmm.
which, I mean, it's a big number, right? So,
Yeah. I don't even know how we would do the cost per bit calculation
yeah,
in that case.
right. I
Right?
know we're going to have to start shifting to
Yeah.
dollar per gigabit, right?
Yeah. I mean, for real. Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. All right. Well, yeah, this was really fascinating. It's going to be, I think, really like one of the more interesting years of all the years that we've been doing this, to look at what happens in 2026, because it's just
Yeah. I
a
mean, there's
real
so many.
inflection point.
Yeah, there's so many things that come into play, right? Like, I mean, we talk about network diversity, and the cost associated with that. We talk about, maybe for the first time, demand exceeding supply in some
Yeah.
instances, right?
Yeah.
And having upgrades able to keep up with requirements. And then, the great unknown is geopolitics. Like, none of us can anticipate when some of those challenges will get resolved. So,
Well,
keeping
the
on.
other great unknown is if our robot overlords, wake up or something like that, right? So we get AGI or ASI, network consumption might just be, mind-boggling. Who knows?
Right. Absolutely. Great.
Color me skeptical about that, just for the record, but still. Yeah, excellent. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining me.
All right. Thanks for having me.
All right, cheers.
Stay tuned. After the break, Brianna Boudreau talks enterprise networks.
Welcome back to the show, Brianna.
Thanks, Greg. It's great to be back.
Yes, excellent. Well, so we're getting into territory in this episode where I'm going to be doing maybe a little less just interviewing than I often do, because these are areas that where your research and mine areas really overlap a lot, right? So, so what we're going to be talking about is partially my area, which is like enterprise networks, wide area networks, but you are the principal investigator on our SD-WAN and network as a service modules, right? So I want to hear, Brianna, what you think was really interesting about SD-WAN and NaaS in 2025. Let's start with SD-WAN. That's something that you and I have been talking about often on the podcast for many years now, right? So,
Yes.
Is it still interesting?
I think so. I think we've reached the phase where SD-WAN has become, I don't know, it's a pretty standard product in the enterprise portfolio. So I know you've seen over the past few years big increases in adoption from the WAN managers that you talk to. There's far fewer now looking at we're researching it or trying to find a vendor. It's pretty standard, I think, for most enterprises these days. And we see that reflected also on the provider side of things. We have over 80 profiles from managed service providers now offering SD-WAN.
Wow.
If you are a carrier in the enterprise space, you've got an SD-WAN product to talk about, often partnering with a few key vendors.
Yeah, absolutely. So. I'll say from the demand side, as it were, forthcoming in 2026, I'll have our update of the WAN Manager survey. In that, it's our highest adoption rates ever at about 75%, 3/4. And of those who don't have it, it's no longer the case that they're like, oh, this is something we're getting to, so much as it is we either want this and have it or are not interested in it. There are some enterprises out there who aren't that interested in it. There's a little group that's still getting around to it, and there's always that long tail. But for the most part, exactly as you say, there's a sort of saturation of that market. How about on the provider side? So you're saying we have 80 MSPs profiled, but that's among a very small group relative to what we used to have of the actual providers, the vendors of SD-WAN themselves, right?
Right. That vendor list has definitely shrunk over the years. And I think that was really one of the bigger stories in 2025 when it comes to SD-WAN. Late 2024, early 2025, we saw some of the original SD-WAN vendors, such as your Nokias, Citrix, Riverbed, they sunsetted their products. And we've really consolidated.
Which is really interesting that not even that those weren't necessarily acquired. They just were not in the SD-WAN business anymore, right?
No, I think it really settled around a key group of vendors that a lot of carriers have partnered with, and others weren't, supporting as many enterprise requirements, and sunsetted those products. This year, we also had the HPE Juniper acquisition was finalized, so that removed some other players, and then Broadcom sold the VeloCloud VMware solution to Arista, so that was another shift in the market.
I think that one's really interesting because Arista is essentially a Cisco competitor, right? They're an OEM. They make networking equipment, and then you have ultimately VMware, which is the opposite of that, right? Virtual machines, right? And VeloCloud as this like virtual product coming into the hardware sort of like CPE world. It seems like that whole SD-WAN thing sort of came full circle back to sort of, I don't know, Cisco version of this is software that runs on equipment that we want to sell you anyway, right? So
for sure, I think it's part of it almost is having a well-rounded offering for enterprise customers. Like if you look at like a Cisco now, there's the appliance, the SD-WAN offering, and they've also got that security platform in there, which is really what enterprises are all looking for altogether.
That's a great point. So it does strike me in my conversations with the WAN managers that I've had as part of that forthcoming WAN manager survey that there's a sense in which SD-WAN is an SSE delivery device now more than anything, right?
It is, and you do see that on who the carriers are partnering with as well to offer those managed SD-WAN solutions. A lot of the vendors that they've consolidated around are those that do have a security focus. You've got your Cisco's, your Fortinets, and now also kind of the Juniper, HPE as well.
So a lot with a security background rather than like, for example, Riverbed or Citrix had a kind of more like network optimization background. That whole game has shifted to security. Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so let's switch gears then to NaaS, which is maybe in some respects has supplanted SD-WAN as the buzzworthy thing over the past couple of years in the enterprise space, and will yet itself probably be supplanted by AIOps, but we'll leave that for some other time, right? But first, I want to start out with from a telegeography perspective. What do we cover about network as a service from the pricing side?
I think that is important because I think as everyone's trying to roll out a NaaS solution and have a NaaS story, it means different things to different people. For us at TeleGeography, we are tracking consumption-based bandwidth. So two major products. One is cloud connectivity and the other is data center to data center. I know for others in the NaaS space, it's more of a managed service offering. It's so we'll help you with your rollout, your management of your network. That's a service. But for us, it's really about that consumption-based bandwidth.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, I call that the sort of like OG NaaS, right? You know what I mean? It's like what NaaS originally was this like consume network like cloud. What I think is interesting is like that specific use case of like bandwidth on demand, right? Which a little bit of a subtle difference between just bandwidth on demand and like more automated provisioning, but let's leave that aside. The bandwidth on demand use case, I think, has pretty limited uptake in the enterprise world. My survey has found that fewer than 1 in 5 enterprises are using it that way. It does lend itself to some industries and some specific use cases or whatever, but it's never going to be in the near future anyway that I can see the primary way that enterprises like consume network, which is like this durable infrastructure. But explain to me a little bit more about what we're tracking there, sort of like pricing wise in terms of like, okay, so I do have this use case, whatever it is, maybe, seasonality to my sales or something like that, where I want to have like maybe a temporary connection or maybe a temporary bandwidth boost to my data centers. How do we piece together what that pricing sort of scheme looks like out there? Because I remember when you were doing this for SD-WAN 5 or 6 years ago, that it took a little while for things to emerge in a way that TeleGeography could say, here's a sort of benchmark that we can collect the same way from everyone. Has that emerged for you in this space?
I think so. I was kind of laughing. I remember when we were trying to figure out how to track SD-WAN at conferences, people writing on like cocktail napkins of here's what's included in the price.
Right,
and we went
right.
through that a little bit with NaaS a few years ago, but really there's a few key components that we're tracking here. For data center interconnect, you're going to have that flexible bandwidth in between those two data centers, but also in each, you'll have a multi-service access port for connectivity. And it's similar components for cloud, but set up a little bit differently. You've got one multi-service access port in the enterprise data center, and that flexible bandwidth to your cloud service provider. So just one port needed for that equation. And then you can toggle in between.
And what kind of terms are we talking about? So that's always been the BOD, bandwidth on demand kind of thing. Is that okay? We're used to enterprises consuming network in like 3-year terms. How granular do we see the providers going?
So for the access ports, most of them report that's a monthly recurring charge. You're setting that up, annual lease, monthly recurring charge. For bandwidth, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. Our survey asks for it priced by the day or the smallest increment that you can provide. And a lot will have a daily price. Most report that they're not seeing anyone really toggle it up and down by the day. It's mostly a monthly
It's a lot
price.
of effort for one day.
Yeah. So there are a few that just give the MRC. And to rationalize, we've kind of multiplied those daily prices by 31 in our research to analyze trends across providers. Got it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Anything else interesting throughout 2025 that you saw in kind of the NaaS space? Any differences in how the providers are thinking about it or what their observations are? I know you talked to a lot of them.
I think we've started to dig into the pricing. It should all be ready in the new year for everybody, but prices so far look stable. It's more about expanding their footprint to be able to offer these more automated services on a larger number of routes or in a greater number of regions. Also a scaling of bandwidth. We've heard from a few providers more 10G being used by enterprise customers, whereas before it had been lower bandwidths as well. Trying to think what else. We recently talked to a provider that was saying, it's less now about kind of that toggling the bandwidth up and down, except for those niche customers you mentioned, like retail or events. And it's more kind of enterprises appreciate that quicker provisioning. They can upgrade a site or they can launch a new site in a much shorter period of time than they could in the past. So it's kind of a set it and forget it, I think was the term that they used. So not necessarily all over your WAN, but in those sites where you need it, it's helpful for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've long said that our colleague Peter, who looks after satellite stuff, he's been sort of stymied in that research by the lack of development in the market, right?
Yep.
But if we ever do get like standardized, I know I'm going to forget this, but Amazon Kuiper just changed their name, I think, to like Amazon Leo or something like that, right? Okay, and so that means they're pushing toward more kind of standardized enterprise grade service than Starlink, which is a little bit more consumer. There's still some startups out there like I always get this mixed up with the electric car company, but Rivada, not Rivian, may have like totally enterprise grade Leo at some point. That would really lend itself to like an absolute immediate kind of provisioning sort of thing. That'd be cool to watch. We're just maybe still a little ways away from that. What about looking forward? I know this is hard, and I apologize because no one can figure out what's going to happen with AI. Even the people who are running the AI companies don't know what's going to happen with AI. But it strikes me that the NaaS providers, carriers, both the pure play kind of NaaS providers and the carriers that have built up a NaaS kind of solution might be in a good position if we see workloads change a lot because of AI adoption at the enterprise level. I should say so far in the WAN Manager survey, we see basically no impact at the enterprise for AI. It's really more about the carrier business to data center. But I mean, do you agree with that take that NaaS might be well positioned to handle whatever weird traffic impacts AI might have?
It might be. I think even on the wholesale side, you're seeing that the impact of AI on the network is still a little bit of a puzzle. Where are you pulling that data from and how these enterprises are going to adopt these apps? It may be, bursts in between. It may not be a constant use case or training, things like that. So I can see that for sure.
Yeah. It's certainly a possibility. It's going to be something to watch, because I think we just don't know. We don't know what the world's going to look like at all in 2 or 3 years, maybe, and
Exactly.
we'll see.
And I think, at least in the NaaS space, I know have been at events this year, that the interoperability is really a big thing, for sure, that people will be talking about going into the year ahead. And how do you achieve that across networks to, provide these NaaS solutions?
Yeah, that's a whole, big thorny issue that we could do a whole episode on at some point. But you're right to bring that up, that behind the scenes for any of this NaaS stuff to truly work, because as we know, the old cliche, like no providers go everywhere, that you have to have this ecosystem of providers that have connected with each other and can communicate these things across their networks. And I just give a headline to that eventual maybe episode, that we're a long way off from that, right? So yeah, there's work to be done there. They've made progress by all means, but yeah, excellent. Anything else you're going to be looking out for in 2026? I think it might be a weird year, 2026. There's a lot of things happening.
I think so. Just a quick plug: we'll have all new SD-WAN and NaaS data to ring in the new year. So be on the lookout for that if you are a TeleGeography subscriber.
Excellent. Yeah, look out for all of that consolidation effect. Who's running what services? I should say specifically that I bake this in, but you do also specifically cover SASE as a part of your SD-WAN product that you're in charge of, right? So.
Yes, we do. We have full profiles of who's offering what SASE services, and we do have a little bit more insight into pricing this year than we did last year. So useful
Excellent.
For enterprise customers as well.
Yeah. And I did include for you a question in the WAN Manager survey about what specific SASE services, and I'll give a little headline there too. The ZTNA is still on top. That seems to be the thing that is pretty universal. So that's interesting, right? So yeah. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. And I know that you and I will probably have maybe a lot to talk about in 2026. I don't know. We'll see.
We'll see. Thanks for having me on, Greg.
All right. Cheers. Thanks for listening. TeleGeography Explains the Internet comes from the experts here at TeleGeography. It's edited and produced by Jane Miller, and it's hosted by me, Greg Bryan. And I also wrote that theme song you're listening to right now. To learn more about our data, jump over to telegeography.com, and we'll see you on the internet.